Hi, Jesse Williams, Combine Product Specialist for Case IH. Today we're going to take a look at some of the screens on the Pro 700 display used to set up and operate AFS Harvest Command. Right now we're starting on the Run 1 screen in the default layout. So when we look in this screen, we're going to get the cross-sectional view of the machine up here that shows us all of our machine settings in one spot. And that's kind of nice with Harvest Command because as the machine is making changes, we're able to see which machine settings are changing, and it will typically highlight it either blue or red depending on the software level as it's changing that machine setting. If you don't have this on your Run 1 or one of your Run tabs, I would recommend starting by setting it up so that you can see this layout on your Run 1. So to do that, if we hit our back button and we go into Toolbox, you can see I'm using the default layouts. It gives me the cross section and the loss monitors on that Run 1. Now, one thing I do sometimes change, and we'll change the layouts here. I've got a demo layout I created for this machine. So in this top left box here, it defaults to crop type. A lot of times I will change that to my instant moisture so that as I'm harvesting I can see what that crop moisture is. Go back to our run screens. One reason I do change that is crop type's not something we change very often. We can do it on Run 2 when we're setting up our field, or we can do it in our Harvest Command setup menus. So when we look at this cross-sectional here, the information it's going to show us rotor RPM, it's going to show us our cage vane position, shows us our bushels per hour, our bushels per acre, our pre-sieve position, our upper sieve position, our lower sieve position, our percent of engine power, our fan RPM, and our concave opening here. Across the bottom, I've got my loss columns and tailings volume displayed there. So with these, I've got this arrow here on there. So that arrow, when we have automation turned on, that's going to be our trigger point. So we'll talk a little bit about setting the sensitivity on these. It's pretty critical to get the sensitivity set properly because automation will not make a change until it sees that graph hit that arrow for a certain amount of time. We've got this shortcut button up at the top up here, so that's going to take us into our setup menus for automation. So I'm going to click that. We come into our setup menus. In the basic tab, we can select our crop type, we can select our strategy, our max ground speed, and our target max engine load. So there's a blue icon next to each of these. If we select that blue icon, it's going to take us through and it's going to give us a little bit more information on each of those items. So for strategy, we've got best grain quality, performance, maximum throughput, and fixed throughput. Performance is typically where I run in most applications. It kind of gives you an overall optimization of the machine. Best grain quality, if you're doing seed, grain quality, food grade crops, and you're concerned about what's going in the tank, best grain quality will make some sacrifices to performance to try to give you less damage and less mog in the tank. Maximum throughput, it's not going to look as closely at your losses. It's going to push the machine a little harder up toward that maximum engine load and maximum ground speed that you've set. Fixed throughput, this is going to give us, if we want to run a certain number of bushels per hour, this will keep us running pretty close to that bushels per hour where we set our feed rate target. So fixed throughput, one application for that would be, for example, for harvesting corn, eastern Nebraska, hilly ground. We got plenty of power with the machine. But we know if we go downhill, there are some cases that we can get close to maxing the cleaning system out. So we might select fixed throughput. We might set our target at somewhere in that 4,000 to 5,000 bushel per hour range. And then it's going to keep us running fairly close to that as we go through the field and through the hills. Maximum ground speed, this is going to be when we're using the feed rate control, the maximum ground speed that the machine is going to be allowed to run with feed rate control. Typically, we recommend setting this somewhere around 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile an hour faster than your typical harvest speed. Target max engine load. This is the max load that it's going to let the engine go up to when we're running feed rate control. And there again, we typically recommend somewhere around that 100 to 105. If we go really high on that, sometimes we see that we go through light crop, the machine will start to speed up. And if we get to a good heavy standing crop suddenly, we're overcorrecting sometimes. So we typically will run that somewhere around that 100 to 105. If we go over to the Advanced tab, so when we come into the Advanced tab, we've got our initial settings up at the top. We got two options with that, current setup and automatic. So automatic, if we're going to use the pre-programmed settings for the machine, for our concave settings, rotor speed, sieves, and all that, as well as the pre-programmed sensitivity settings for the machine, that is what we would use. If we want to go out, we want to adjust the machine, we want to kind of get everything dialed in manually first, and then we want to turn automation on. After we've kind of dialed everything in, we would do current setup. And when we do it that way, once we turn automation on, it's going to start with the settings that you have adjusted the machine to, and then it will adjust from there if it sees the need. Adjust frequency, we've got a low, medium, and a high. So low is going to look at the operating parameters every 40 seconds, and it's going to make adjustments. Medium is going to look at it every 20 seconds, and it's going to average out about 10 seconds worth of data to make those adjustments. And high is going to look at it every 20 seconds as well, but uses a little bit different filtering than medium as far as the peaks and valleys that it's looking at to make it a little bit more sensitive on the changes. And then we've got our threshing condition. So with threshing condition, we've got a easy, medium, and hard threshing condition. And what threshing condition is controlling is it's controlling my cage vane position, and it's controlling my minimum rotor RPM. So for example, if I was harvesting corn and I selected easy thresh, it's going to allow my rotor RPM to run from 0 up to about 400 RPM. If I selected medium, it's going to bring my minimum rotor speed up to 350 RPM, and it's going to slow those vanes down more. If I selected hard, it's going to bring that minimum rotor RPM up around 400, and it's going to take those vanes and it's going to put them in the slow or the very slow position. Typically, we recommend starting off on easy. If you're seeing that you're not getting all the crop threshed, you're getting some rotor loss, you can bump that up to medium and then to hard. On our next tab, we have our sensitivity adjustments here. So this is where we can come in and we can manually dial those numbers up and down on those sensitivities. So if I've been through the process on the run one screen of adjusting my sensitivity with my acceptable and could be more or too much, and I'm still not exactly where I want to be, I can come in here, I can dial those values up and down a little bit in here. One thing to point out on the tailings, so tailings is a sensitivity adjustment now. In the past with the 10 series through the 40 series machines, we were adjusting the tailings volume alarm. So we typically set that up around 100. That way you didn't get an audible alarm from the display until your tailings was close to maxed out. With the 250 series machines, tailings sensitivity is going to adjust how the graph is displaying. And typically I run that on the default settings that will be in the machine when it comes out of the factory. If the graph really isn't doing much, I may bump that sensitivity up a little bit. If it's constantly maxing out, I'll probably do a kill stall, dump my tailings, see what I got in there, and maybe adjust that sensitivity based on what I'm seeing in the tailings. We've also got our feed rate sensitivity down here, so we've got a number of options with that, and that's how fast feed rate is going to adjust our ground speed based on input from the machine. So if I set it to very high, if it sees that engine load approaching max, it sees my sieve loss going up, it's going to be pretty aggressive about making a change. If I set it to very low, it's going to be much less aggressive at making that change. In some cases, in some crop conditions, it may not make the change fast enough to keep me from walking grain out the back, slugging the machine, something like that. So typically we recommend running feed rate sensitivity in the high setting. That works pretty good for most applications. We can also hit the reset sensitivities down at the bottom to go back to our factory settings on everything. Then we've got our headland tab down here. So with the headland tab, we can do offsets on the fan, the upper sieve, the lower sieve, and the preset when we're turning the machine on the headland. So when we raise that head up to turn on the headland, a lot of times what I will do is I'll drop that fan RPM down and I'll open the upper sieve up a little bit. That helps any of that loose grain that can get walked out the back or blown out the back when you're turning on the end. It helps save some of that grain. The lower sieve, what I will typically do with that is I will close that down some while I'm turning on the headland. And one example for that would be if you're harvesting soybeans. A lot of times you will see as you're turning on the end of the field, the machine's unloading. That's when you're getting some of those pods coming in the tank. So I will typically play with that value and close it down a little bit at a time until I get to where when I turn on the end, I'm not seeing pods going in the tank. Probably seeing my tailings volume go up a little bit as it's sending those pods back through the rethresher on the headland of the field. Upper sieve, I typically will open that somewhere around 2 to 4 millimeters, and fan speed, I will typically slow that down somewhere between about 150 and 200 RPM as I'm turning on the end. Pre-sieve, I typically don't mess with pre-sieve with headlands. So one thing with this, with the automated machines that does make this a little bit confusing, when we come in here, our values are in inches, and we're all used to adjusting those sieves now in millimeter settings. So to get that to something that we understand, we can go into our toolbox, we can go to our operator, we can change our units to metric, we can go back into that automation menu either through our automation tab here on the main screen, or using our shortcut button from run 1. And if we go to headland now, those values are in millimeters, so I can adjust them in millimeters. So close that lower sieve down a little bit, open the upper sieve up a little bit. Get done with that, I can go into my toolbox, I can change those units back to USA, and then go back into my automation menu. We've got a status tab in here as well. This just kind of shows us all the items in the system, gives us a check mark that everything is there. And then we've got a ranges tab. So ranges is new. It came out in software, pre-release software last fall, some of the 2020 machines that got built last fall. So ranges allows us with automation to come in here and give certain adjustments, ranges that automation has to work in. And when you come in here initially, this will be set to off. You can turn ranges on. Once you turn it on, you will see the screen similar to this. So we can select our crop type, our strategy, our threshing condition, and then we can give each of those configurations ranges to work in. So typically we recommend that you use this very minimally. If you come in here and you start making a lot of adjustments with ranges, you may get into a condition where Harvest Command is going to have a hard time working or a hard time responding to the changing crop conditions. So one example here that we ran into last year in wheat harvest, we were seeing that the pre-sieve was opening too wide in some conditions. So what we can do there is we could come in here and we could tell it, I want my pre-sieve to go between 1 and 6. And that's going to keep that pre-sieve from going over that 6 millimeter setting so that if I do get into a condition where I'm going downhill, less chance of getting any grain in the fan with that. My last tab in my automation menus is my info tab. So if I come to my info tab, it just kind of walks me through for my crop type, my recommended concave opening, spreader speed, feeder speed, recommended configurations for spiked rest bars, non-spiked, and straight bars, as well as my module configuration there. So once I've kind of done all of my setup and I'm ready to start running automation, I will need to turn automation on. And in this machine, automation is currently turned on. If we look up here, we can see we've got that little icon up here. It's got the A in it. That's indicating that automation is turned on. So if I look up on my headliner, I've got my automation switch. And each time I cycle that switch, I will cycle automation on or off. So I just cycled automation off. I'm back to the 1, which is indicating that I'm in automatic crop settings. Cycle it back on again. Automation is turned on, and you'll see that those arrows pop back up there. So when we look at our graphs across the bottom of the display, they're a little bit different than they were in non-automated machines. We've split these two and added some extra information there. So on the left-hand side of the first one, we've got our rotor loss. The right-hand side of the first one, we've got our damaged grain. The left-hand side of the center, we've got our sieve loss. The right-hand side, we've got our material other than grain. And then we've got our tailings over here on the right-hand side. And if you look at these right now, they are grayed out. And this came with the newer software versions. Basically what we're making you do to make an adjustment on them now is we're making you run the machine in the field a certain amount of time to get a certain amount of crop flow through there, and then we're filtering out some of the highs and lows. So we used to tell you early on with automation that before you made an adjustment with them, you either needed to press the button, slow the machine down, clean it out, stop, get out and look out the back, come back in and enter whether it was acceptable, too much, or could be more, or you had to press that while you were running in a similar condition to where you did the loss count and then look in there. With the newer software, we're filtering out a lot of that stuff, like what the machine was seeing as you stopped it to clean out, what it was seeing as you started to take off in the field. So it's much more user-friendly now. You can basically go out and harvest, stop the machine, get out, look on the ground, come back in here, hit your button, and enter whether it's acceptable, too much, or could be more in there. So ideally what we want to see with our sensitivities, when I'm harvesting, I've got everything adjusted, my losses are looking good, my sample's looking good. I want to see that graph probably running somewhere between about 30 and 50%, kind of bouncing around in that area there. If I adjust it like we used to in the older machines, typically we would adjust that sensitivity so that the graph was kind of just bouncing down in the bottom at the green. It really didn't ever come up past that unless you hit a condition in the field where your loss really went up. But if I adjust it like that, automation is going to be pretty sluggish. It's not going to do a lot for us. So I need to get in the habit of seeing those graphs run a little bit higher. And then as those crop conditions change a little bit and it brings that graph up to this 75% point and it turns yellow or red, that's what's going to trigger the machine to make a change. And that will be true of all of these. The rotor loss, the damaged grain, the sieve loss, and the material other than grain. So when you press this and you get the pop-up, it will have one of those items in that list grayed out. And the item that is grayed out in that list is where that machine has been running for that sensitivity. So if it's typically been running right around 50% through the field, or averaging 50%, when you hit the button for the pop-up, it will have acceptable grayed out. If it's been running at 75%, as you go through the field, you hit the button, it's going to have too much grayed out. So that's what that grayed out means. It means it's already got the sensitivity adjusted to put the graph into that range. And one thing to keep in mind with these, so we've got rotor loss here, we've got damage grain here. So if I've got rotor loss, the machine is going to try to slow down the vanes, and it's going to bring that rotor RPM up to try to address that. If I've got damaged grain, the machine is going to typically try to slow that rotor RPM down. So you'll get these two kind of working against each other, and sometimes you've got to look at what you've got on the ground or in the tank, and you got to go in and maybe manually dial those sensitivities up or down a few points to get it to where it's not constantly making unnecessary changes, but it is making the changes that you want it to make. Same thing with the sieves. If my sieve loss goes up, it's going to open the sieves up. If my material other than grain goes up, it's going to close the sieves down. So it's a little bit of a balancing act to adjust the sensitivities for both of them so that you're getting the sample that looks like you want, but you're not getting the grain going out the back of the machine. We'll talk a little bit about the feed rate control. So with feed rate control, if we look up here at the top, we got 2 mile per hour indications. So this bigger one here, the center one, that's going to be my actual speed that I'm harvesting at. So you can see it says 0.0 right now. This one here, once we turn feed rate on, that's going to be what I've got my upper limit for feed rate set at. So if we go back into those setup menus, you should see it'll have that 5 miles per hour right there once we get it set up and running. So when we get to the field and we want to engage and run feed rate, what we will do is we'll get the machine up to speed using our hydro handle. Up here we've got our feed rate button here. So I'm going to bring it up close to my normal harvesting speed, and then I'm going to press and hold this button until it beeps. That's going to set my feed rate target. So as it's setting that feed rate target, you will see this icon up here will turn to an hourglass. It'll sit there for a minute and then it will turn black. Once it's turned black, it is engaged feed rate at that target speed. If that target speed is below your max and all the parameters are acceptable, it will bring that speed up until it hits that max speed. If you see something like your sieve or your rotor go up and it can't fix that loss with its basic machine settings, it will next bring that ground speed down. Now once we've engaged it with the newer software, we just leave the handle where it is. With the older software, we had to engage and then full stick the handle to get it to allow it to go up to that maximum speed that we had selected up here. New software, we engage. If we want to disengage, we bump the handle a little bit in either direction, and that will disengage feed rate. After I've disengaged it, if I want to re-engage it again, I momentarily click that button. So typically when I turn back in the row at the end of the field, I'm going to use my hydro handle to get up close to that speed that I want to run at, and then click my button to engage feed rate. So it helps to get close to that speed that you want to run at. If I start at around 1 mile an hour, I click the button. It's sometimes a little sluggish if I'm harvesting at 5 miles an hour of getting up to that 5 miles an hour. Plus then my feed rate engagement, my hydro handle is way back here. If I go up to 5 miles per hour and then I move this handle back a little bit to disengage, I'm de-accelerating that machine way back down to 1 mile per hour. Versus if I go up to that 5 miles per hour or close to it, click my button, and then I'm harvesting at 5.5 miles an hour and I wiggle my hydro handle a little bit, I'm only de-accelerating 0.5 mile per hour as I disengage from feed rate. Now with feed rate, we can also adjust that target speed a little bit. And to do that, we've got our shift button up on the front of the multifunction handle. If we hold that and we do our hitter up down, it will adjust my feed rate target. So if feed rate is acting a little bit sluggish for you, you'll press and hold that button, bump the plus once or twice, and see if it responds better and acts like you want then. So we'll go back over to our display, go to our main menu, and take a look at our calibration tab. So one thing I have found with automated machines that you want to make sure you've got calibrated right is your inclination sensors. That gets calibrated on the assembly line at the plant, but at that point the machines are sitting on the axles. They do not have tires installed, so they are sitting at a little bit different angle than what they'll be sitting at once you install the tires. What I've found is typically the machine thinks it's going downhill on flat ground. So I would recommend, if you got a good level concrete pad, you set the machine on the concrete pad, you go in there, you hit your OK, and it's going to calibrate those inclination sensors to level with the tires on. What you will see if you haven't calibrated those is you'll have your fan set at a certain RPM, whether you're using manual settings or automation. Let's say we've got our fan at 1,000 RPM, and when we're on flat ground, that fan's actually running above that setting. So it might be running up around 1,100 RPM, and then when we go downhill, that fan speed really goes up high. And the reason for that is that inclination sensor is not calibrated correctly to get the auto fan to work properly. And what you'll see with that sometimes with automation turned on is that as that fan speed goes up too high, now it's going to start making sieve adjustments. It's going to open those sieves up, then it's going to start adjusting the fan speed, and you just kind of get into a situation where it's kind of fighting itself. So start off before you start harvesting, running automation, find a good level surface, calibrate those inclination sensors. Not a lot of other calibrations associated with Harvest Command. You do have a feed rate no load calibration, so the first time you hook a head up or try to engage feed rate, you may get a pop-up that says 0 load calibration not done, and it's going to tell you to raise the feeder all the way up, engage the separator and the feeder, and run the machine at 2100 RPM for 20 seconds. So I typically recommend anytime you change header types, raise that feeder house all the way up, engage the feeder and the separator, bring your throttle to full throttle, and sit there for about 20 seconds. And that should take its no load calibration. So what it's looking at when it does the no load calibration is it's going to look at how much horsepower does it take to run the combine and the header with no load. It's got a pressure transducer on the hydrostat, so between the pump and motor settings and the pressure, it can calculate how much horsepower the ground drive is using, and then it knows for your feed rate how much horsepower is left over to process crop. Couple other things associated with the Harvest Command machines. If we go into our Combine Info tab and we scroll over to our Cleaning tab and then scroll down to the bottom, Harvest Command uses sieve pressure sensors. These are differential pressure sensors. They are mounted back at the back of the upper sieve. There's one on the top of the upper sieve. There's one on the bottom of the upper sieve. So Harvest Command is using this in conjunction with the sieve loss sensor to help determine what the sieve load is. And you're able to come in here in this tab here and see these. You can also set these up on one of your run screens, in the boxes on your run screens where you can see them from a run screen. But this is kind of useful if you're trying to determine how well you've got your sieve distribution adjusted. So if you come in here and one of these has a positive number, the other one has a negative number, there's a pretty good spread between the two. That's an indication that we're probably heavy on our sieve distribution on one side. So we can adjust that using some of our basic machine settings. If we go in and look at the operator's manual, it'll tell you for your different crops, if you're heavy on the right hand side, it may have you start by tightening your concaves or speeding your rotor up. I typically start with that, possibly looking at my concave configuration, looking to make sure I don't have any plugged concaves, and then I can try to fine-tune that distribution. If I go back into the toolbox, into the Cleaning tab, scroll down to the bottom, I've got my sieve offset. So we've used that a lot in the past to help fine-tune that sieve distribution. So typically I'm going to adjust that in about 0.2 increments at a time. So about 0.2 at a time. I'll run the machine. I'll either kill, stall, and look on the grain pan to see what I've got. or I can come back into that combine info, scroll down to the bottom, and I can see if that adjustment is helping even that out. So with that, for example, if I was heavy on the right hand side, I would start to put positive offset in. If I was heavy on the left hand side, I'd start to put negative offset in. If I'm out in the field, I can't remember which way positive or negative goes, I'll just come in here and I'll put about 5 in there. That's going to be a pretty aggressive offset. If I start the machine up, run it for a couple minutes, shut it off, I can get out, walk around the back of the machine and see which direction that leaned my sieves. And that lets me know which way positive goes, which way negative goes. Some other controls that we picked up with the Harvest Command machines, we'll have our cage vane position here. So we're able to adjust that cage vane position. As we press that button, we get the pop-up on the display, and then we can adjust those cage vanes. So with that cage vane adjustment, there is also a calibration with that. So if we come in here, scroll down to the bottom, we've got our rotor cage vane calibration. So what that will do is it will run the vanes all the way to their full extreme in both directions, and it calibrates that actuator. Now you may see sometimes as you're harvesting, you may get a warning or a pop-up that says cage vanes blocked. And it asks you to move the cage vanes in both directions. Typically with the machine running, if you got a little bit of something hung up in one of those adjustment slots, it will pull it out as you adjust the vanes manually. If that doesn't take care of the issue, then you probably want to shut the machine down, pull your left-hand rear rotor cover door off, and look in there and look at those slots. Make sure you don't have a corn cob stuck through one, some straw, soybean stems or something like that. Make sure they're clean. Make sure they will move all the way in both directions using your switch that's in the toolbox in the back. And as long as everything looks good on the ground, come back in here and run that cage vane calibration, and that will typically resolve any issues you may be having with getting the pop-up for the cage vanes blocked. Other controls that we do have a pre-sieve adjustment from the cab now, standard on all of the AFS Harvest Command machines, optional on a non-Harvest Command machine. So with that, we also have a calibration for the pre-sieve. We've got a set of switches down on the ground. So we got pre-sieve, lower sieve, upper sieve. We've got our switches at the back of the machine, just like we've always had, for setting the clearance on the upper and the lower sieve. And then if we look on the upright support between the two shields on the side of the machine, when we've got that left-hand rear rotor cover door off, we've got a switch there that allows us to adjust that pre-sieve while we're checking that opening. So what we want to do when we're calibrating sieves, it tells us to completely close the sieve down, open the sieve back up to 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch, and then we hit the OK in here. So very important to close the sieve completely. That way we're removing any slack from the linkage, the actuator, and all that as we open the sieve up. So that's going to give us our most accurate sieve settings from the cab. That pretty well takes us through most of the settings and adjustments for operating Harvest Command. Thank you for taking the time to watch the video. If you have any questions, please contact your dealer and have them work with you. They know how to get in touch with me to answer any further questions you might have. Thank you.